Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to our event this evening. My name is Clive Parry. I am Vice President of Sage Publishing and also involved in Pacific Standard. I thought as the event is about who's paying that reporter, I want to just say a quick few words about who Sage is and who is paying for this event. And just so you know our background before I introduce our moderator. For those who don't know Sage, we are historically a social sciences publisher. We do also publish in STM. We were founded in 1965 by Sarah McCune and her husband George, and over the years have expanded out internationally and now have publishing offices in Thousand Oaks in California, where we're based, and also in Washington, D.C. Since 2008, when CQ Press became part of the Sage family. As I say, we publish beyond the sort of books and journals and the social sciences that we've published for many years. We now publish a wide range of library products, things like CQ Research, which I think you'll find in your packet, databases, archives, videos, and so on. We're moving into big data and looking at how we can be supporting big data. And I know there's a lot of presentations at this conference on big data in politics, and that's an area we feel there's a lot of opportunity for. But also one of the key reason Sarah founded Sage was she believed not in the importance of education research and the broader dissemination of that research to create a better society. And that's why I think there's a very good connection between Sage and the topics that this panel is covering, as well as, of course, that we publish very extensively in communication and media and politics. One thing I should say in terms of the sort of future of Sage, we are guaranteed to maintain our independence. It's something we're very proud of, and we have an estate plan set up such that after Sarah's passing, she's very much involved in the company still, I'm pleased to say, will be owned by a number of higher education institutions. They'll be the beneficial owners, and will report as a team into a trust. So as long as we can maintain our financial viability, we can take that mission-driven approach to publishing. Part of that mission is the funding of an organisation called the Social Justice Foundation, and the primary work of that foundation is the publishing of Pacific Standard magazine, which is also represented in your package today, along with Mother Jones as well. So there's quite a few things to read in there. So that's our other connection with this. That's an entirely separate to Sage. It's a non-profit foundation, but the aim of Pacific Standard, as Nick will talk more, is how do we get that research into a wider audience, and that's why Sarah set up the magazine almost 10 years ago now. So with that, I want to now introduce our moderator for the evening, Dr. Don Kettle. He is a professor and former dean of the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, and also a non-resident fellow at the Partnership for Public Service, the Volk Alliance, and the Brookings Institution. Don is the author of many books, I'm pleased to say many of them for Sage, including the 7th edition of Politics and the Administrative Process, and also Little Bites of Big Data for Public Policy. And then more recently, he's written a book chapter for us on fake news, and I believe there's a preview version of that in the pack too. Don is also no stranger to national and international news media. He's appeared frequently on NPR, Good Morning America, ABC News, many other channels too. So a really good person to be moderating our discussion this evening. So thank you very much, Don, and I'll hand over to you to introduce our panel.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Thanks so much for the introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming. And you're in for a treat because we've had just a great conversation before getting going, which we broke off so we can join all of you in the conversation as well. We're going to start with some talk here about some of these issues and then invite you to join us in just a little while. So as questions occur to you, I invite you just to jot them down because we're going to have a chance to be able to get back to those. I have some questions I want to begin with, but first let me ask the members of the panel just to introduce themselves as we go, and then we'll start with a round of questions about trying to explore this basic question about what is this fake news thing, where's it coming from, and how does the way in which media get funded influence the way that news gets covered. First.
Hi, everybody. My name is Steve Katz, and I'm the publisher at Mother Jones. Mother Jones is a nonprofit, also published by a funny-sounding entity called the Foundation for National Progress. So between the two of us, we've got it wired. so to speak. We've been around for 41 years. We've got a staff of 87 with offices, headquarters here and bureaus in Washington and New York. And I'm sure I'll have more to tell you about what we do and how we do it in just a second.
Thanks, Steve. Linda.
Hi, I'm Linda Streen. I spent more than 25 years in newspapers, 5 of them actually, across California, so I'm a recovering journalist. Now I spend my days still talking to reporters, but also talking a lot to social scientists. I am the communications director at the Public Policy Institute of California. That's an independent, nonpartisan think tank that focuses on California policy issues. Our mission is to improve public policy in California, which means our work will never be done. And we are funded, since we're talking funding, with an endowment by William Hewlett. You'll recognize that name as one of the co-founders of Hewlett-Packard. And then we also receive support from a lot of other foundations throughout the state.
That's great. Thanks, Linda. Nicholas.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Nick Jackson. I am the editor-in-chief of Pacific Standard, which, as Clive mentioned, is published by the Social Justice Foundation, based in Santa Barbara, south of here. And the Social Justice Foundation does a few other things, but it's primarily been set up to put out the magazine, which is first and foremost a social and environmental justice national magazine. We print 8 times a year, up from 6 last year, and every day online, obviously. But what differentiates us from our sort of core competitors like The Atlantic or the New York Times Magazine is rather than sort of relying on opinion or editorial, academics are by far our most frequent primary source, and we often use social and behavioral science to come to the story decisions and to inform everything that we do in print.
That's great. Thanks, Nick. We have a great panel here, and what I want to do is begin by asking a question that somebody, and not only am I a recovering dean, but I'm also living inside the swamp. My office is inside the Beltway, and most of us wake up in the morning obsessed with whatever it is that's going on, and then can't turn the TV off or click off our devices at night without checking to see what might have happened recently. But the underlying piece of this that we're concerned about, for starters, is this idea about fake news, about what it is that we see, how we come to see it, and whether anybody believes any of it. And what I want to do is begin, if I can, with a question for each of the panelists. Maybe if I could start with you, Nick, about the question about what is this fake news thing? Is it anything more than just the creation of echo chambers to try to run down your opponents and boost yourself up? Or is there's something more than that that's really going on in this fake news thing?
Yeah, so you're going to throw it to me to define it? That's it's impossible. It's all of that and more. I mean, I think at its core, we consider fake news to be entirely fabricated information that's often done for profit or political gain. It's been around forever. It's taken a bunch of forms. We used to think about it as supermarket tabloids and photo manipulation, but I think we now associate it with Russia in 2016 and Donald Trump because it's been weaponized. But really, it's a very convenient umbrella for talking about a lot of things, from complete falsehoods to even recirculating old accurate information that is no longer relevant, but sort of achieves a different goal than it was originally intended to.
The idea is just weaponizing information in some way that is on a scale and at a level that we wouldn't imagine before.
Yeah, I mean, it's been around forever, which is the really interesting thing. I mean, you think of like The Sun, right? The classic supermarket tabloid with Bat Boy on the cover. That's like classic fake news, and that. I mean, Bat Boy is literally from 1830. It's about 2 centuries old at this point. It was part of a New York paper special package of stories about what we would find on the moon when we eventually got there. It's great. It sells ads.
Yeah, and that's assuming that, in fact, we actually did get to the moon and it wasn't just filmed in Arizona.
Yes.
But actually, I've been doing some research on this, and I've been able to track fake news back to Antony and Cleopatra. And there is a story, but I'm still in the process of trying to document, that most of what you've seen, if you've seen the Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor movie, was in fact fake news. that he was involved in the plot, of course, against Caesar, and in the process of trying to track him down and wipe him out, the story was spread that you couldn't possibly want a guy like this to be running the Roman Empire because he was known to be consorting with people in Egypt who couldn't possibly be loyal to Rome. And so this news was spread, and so that the Antony and Cleopatra story that we've seen in the movie is, according to some accounts, largely a product of fake news itself. So it goes back a long ways. Linda?
Absolutely. William Randolph Hearst, a name that used to appear on my paychecks, you'll remember him from Yellow Journalism. There's a lot of debate about whether he really started the Spanish-American War, but he certainly had a lot to do with whipping up a frenzy over it. That was Yellow Journalism. That was fake news. They were stunts. Journalists would go out there and do stunts and stage things that never really happened. So you're right, it's as old as time. And the other thing that's not new is politicians taking offense when news organizations uncover things that they would like not to be uncovered. So I think what's new here, to take Nick's point, is technology has made the dissemination of it very, very easy and very fast.
Steve?
I would just add one thing. The piece of this puzzle that really interests me is this sense of asymmetry between different political networks and media networks. There's some really interesting research coming out of the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard on propaganda and partisanship. And what they're demonstrating is that the networks of influence among right-wing media shops is way more concentrated and focused than a more opened, middle-of-the-road to liberal news network. And so there's a self-reinforcing pattern on the right of message development and dissemination that is less developed among liberal and left networks. And in the last election, their argument is that asymmetry actually coincided with a candidate who knew how to use it on social media to his vast advantage. And it went largely unexplored during the election season. And we're continuing to live with it right now to the point where, as Nick said, we've got both a weaponized system of propaganda, probably, maybe, who knows, probably with state actors behind it, and also a coherent messaging system among a set of highly partisan, influential people, both on the street and in positions of authority, to get their messages out. I think it's a very different situation than in the past, and I think the idea of it being weaponized is really accurate. And so it exposes journalists in the United States anyway to a threat environment the likes of which we haven't lived in many, many years, if ever.
There's a new Gallup poll that's just released in the last week that, among other things, explored the question, differences between Democrats and Republicans about whether or not you trust what it is that you see. And the basic message of this was, a generation ago, there was almost no difference between Democrats and Republicans about trusting the news. Now there's an enormous gap, and Republicans are far, far, far less likely to trust what it is that they see in the news than Democrats are. I mean, how much of this do you think really comes down to a suspicion about the source of the funding, about who it is who's paying for it? That a sense that you get what you pay for, that people are paying for results, that the different parties trust differently what it is that they see because they have underlying assumptions about who it is who's responsible for producing the news that they're watching. Steve, if I could ask you to start.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're the target of that criticism, and it's occasionally tied to money. Usually George Soros is the bad guy. And we don't get any money from George Soros, but who's counting? But I think the question of money is a second-level problem for those people who distrust opposing viewpoints. I think it's at this point, it's not scientific or anything. I'm just But I think we are living in this partisan tribal moment in American politics where there's a belief system and then you go find the facts to justify the belief system rather than the other way around.
Linda, I saw you nodding your head, and then I wanted to ask Nick the same question.
I mean, I think fake news really isn't about news at all. It's really about polarization. We do public opinion polling at PPIC, and we do a statewide poll. And in the last several years, we found that polling on climate change, that used to have bipartisan consensus that climate change is happening, is real, and the state should address it. It has now become a completely polarized issue, and with Republicans and Democrats in terms of their belief in it and in terms of their belief that action should be taken. And that is a startling change on an issue that we all thought, or many of us thought, was settled science.
Nick?
Yeah, I think a lot of this is the technology issue that Linda was talking about at the beginning, which is like fake news in many forms has been a thing since as long as news has been a thing, but Facebook and Google have not been. In 15 minutes, Facebook reaches more people than the biggest newspaper the world has ever produced can reach. And they are profit-driven platforms that rely on the echo chamber and the filter bubble, and you are just self-reinforcing all day long over and over again. I think the first thing that consumers need to do if they want to fight this is think actively about what their media sources are and how they can diversify them. But that, I think, really is part of the problem here. And Facebook and Google have done a lot publicly to say that they're trying to fight these things, but ultimately they are profit-driven businesses, and the more time you can keep someone on your site and the more advertising revenue you can generate, the better. It comes the great story of the 2016 election is that you would Google popular vote, and the top Google result is that Hillary Clinton lost.
I would argue that there are more that Facebook and other social media companies can do. There are engineering solutions here, but there has to be public pressure brought to bear for those to happen. There are ways to make sourcing more visible. There are ways to do fact checks. You can't edit a tweet, for example. And you can imagine if you use Twitter, how would that look? I refuse to believe that there's not an engineering solution to that if there's the will and the pressure to make one.
So just to add on to what you were just saying, I actually was talking to someone today who is very much involved in that discussion, and there is a project underway called the Trust Project that will be launching a tool with several leading media outfits and some of the platforms, Google and Facebook, they hope, that will signal to readers based on certain kinds of criteria the trustworthiness of the source. So it's a very challenging First Amendment navigation to make because you do have platforms with essentially monopoly power, and where the algorithm that's shaping what we see is considered a trade secret, and they're not regulated properly. So all of those things militate against the platforms doing the right thing because there's no leverage point. It's a purely voluntary thing. And this Trust Project may be at least an initial lever to start to put some light into how these decisions get made.
One of the puzzles here is that we've gone to two different kinds of things. And for those of you, you've all been in business for a long time, and probably if we added this up, we'd have generations worth of experience here on this stage just by putting all this together. And which I'm glad for, because we need some perspective here, because the two issues. One is that the old days of understanding political conversation and discourse in terms of media as we had traditionally captured it has changed dramatically. And so I'm struck by how quickly we got into discussion about social media and other things, with media understood not as just broadcast and print, but in a whole variety of other things. And a second piece of this is the degree to which that media is itself unmediated. That one of the roles that the media as an institution traditionally had performed was to somehow, not so much filter, but to try to at least distill truth out of the conversations that are happening. And what I'm hearing from you is the two things are happening simultaneously that are leading to polarization. One is that there's a lot more stuff, a lot more places where people are getting information, and that information is, for the most part, unmediated, so that people tend to plug into what it is that reinforces their beliefs and dismiss the stuff that doesn't, without anybody checking to see whether or not it's true. And so how is this both changing your business and changing in your mind what it is that is going on as we're trying to make sense out of all this stuff? Hard question, who wants to take a crack at that first? Steve?
So in some respects, it has completely transformed our business. In other ways, it hasn't touched it. So when Mother Jones started in 1976, it was a print magazine. It came out, I think, originally 10 times a year, then it went to 8, now it's at 6. And
We're going the other direction.
Yeah, good luck. That's keep it up. And we had it came out of a moment of the environmental movement and anti-imperialist stuff and the women's movement, LGBT campaigns, really informed by that cultural and generational moment, and carried forward on that strength. It had 300,000 subscribers within a couple of years. It won a National Magazine Award in its second year of existence, and was on the road for many years. This thing called Mosaic was invented in 1991 or 92, whatever. We did the Mojo Wire in 1993. It's like, wow, this is cool. We got to take all this stuff from our magazine and put it on the web. Isn't that great? Nobody read it, and it wasn't actually until, and this is the pivot point, it wasn't actually until 2005 where we hit a juncture, and this is where it's changed. The juncture was, well, we could either throw a big party and really celebrate 30-odd years of kick-ass journalism and then carry on, or we take a huge jump, a huge leap off the cliff with a little bit of fundraising, and reinvent ourselves as a digital-first operation, which we did, which took 8 or 9 years, including a great recession, to work. And so now our audience is still has a terrific magazine. There's a couple 100,000 people that plunk down their subscription revenue every year. And there's an audience online, half of which comes from social media, of 14 million people a month. So our ability to use and plug into this digital space was both the driver and the outcome. So that's a total transformation in workflow, work process, qualifications for journalists, interactions with audience, modes of fundraising, you name it. The thing that didn't change was the necessity to protect the quality of the journalism, to curate it properly. That's, I think, what we do now is try to provide context and curation, as well as what does today's news mean to us as we report on it, and to provide our readers with what we believe to be fact-checked and accurate reporting of the day. So that hasn't changed.
Can I build on that rosy glow you started? I have to say, because I'm old enough to say it, I never thought in my lifetime I would ever see a news war like we saw during the Watergate era between the Washington Post and the New York Times. We got one now. And it's because people are willing to pay for high-quality news. Both of those organizations, along with Vanity Fair and others who do in-depth reporting like you guys, are seeing their readership rising. And it's because of this phenomenon. There is a need for news, and people are willing to pay for it. And we all thought that wasn't going to happen a couple of years ago. We thought the whole thing was going off a cliff. But now we've got a healthy news environment, not for everybody. It's still challenging. Everybody has to diversify their revenue sources to make it. But honestly, you're seeing quality content. And I think it's too easy to romanticize the past. I remember the days of monolithic news sources and trusted news sources, and guess what that got us? Vietnam. And you know, that did terrible damage in terms of life, cost, our standing in the world. So I think what we're seeing now, you know, the sky's not necessarily falling. I'll stop now.
That's a piece of good news, Nick. I thought when you said, "Can I build on that?" you were gonna bury it. So is that my job now?
Yeah. If you want to, go ahead. We'll give you a shovel.
No, I don't want to. I mean, I think yes. It's you are right. are in the middle of probably the greatest newspaper war that, well, I was going to say we'll ever see, but who knows what's coming.
For everybody who may not be insiders, can you explain the war, what it's about, who the combatants are?
Yeah, I'm just talking about the New York Times and the Washington Post, which are like the two big newspapers that are making it for two different reasons. One, because they recognized the value of subscription revenue before anybody else did and really doubled down on it. And I think the New York Times gets 60 or 70% of its revenue from readers now, as opposed to advertisers. And I'm being generous with that because part of that 60 or 70% is the 2 million people who don't read the newspaper but really want to do that crossword puzzle every day, or are into the cooking app. So it's,
It's a good app.
The newspaper is doing really well, but it's not all news. And the other is the Washington Post, which is mostly doing well because it's got a major investment from Jeff Bezos, who obviously owns Amazon and some weird rocket companies. They're just competing in a war for scoops and stories, and they are both doing better than ever. But I think that so too are 100 fake news sources. And while the New York Times has, 2 million paying subscribers, that is, 1 out of every 150 people you're going to encounter, and most people you meet in a day do not pay for the New York Times. But many of them do use Facebook or listen to their crazy uncle and are getting news from a million other sources as well. So part of the transition that Mother Jones and everybody else had to make to be digital first, and I think, Don, this gets back to your original question, is that you've really atomized the product and you can slap the Mother Jones label on top of something and hopefully that stands for something.
Whether you like it or not.
Right, whether you like it or not, but so too can Forbes. We can think of like the Daily Stormer and these wild alt-right products as being fake news, but I would put places like BuzzFeed and the Huffington Post and Forbes in that category a little bit as well. They wouldn't want to answer to that, but they have built giant contributor networks with thousands of people who are not vetted or go through the same process, but do still benefit from the name being slapped across the top. So now you're just competing on like a story by story, piece by piece, post by post, tweet by tweet. You're competing with everything. And I think, Don, what was really interesting about the way you phrased your original question here is I think you kind of switched between using news and media as though they were the same thing. And that's part of the issue here. It's like my competition is not what Steve's team is doing up here in San Francisco. My competition is also like Candy Crush. It's just we're competing for attention. Like we're in the game against everybody else. So not only do I need to find the resources, let's get back to like who pays for this stuff and whether it informs our work. Not only do I need to find the resources to do the work right, which costs more than anybody wants to accept it for costing. Like the New York Times is not going to get by, no matter how expensive your subscription is, without finding alternate revenue streams.
And they just founded a nonprofit, too, the Times.
Right. That's the news this morning, right? We can talk about Trump, but the news this morning is the New York Times just moved Janet Elder, who's been with the Times for 35 years, into a new position to start a team to go after grant and foundation and nonprofit money, and they're going to take everything that
they're going to take all our
rely
money.
on.
Yeah. Let me ask a much too long question to get your reaction, in two parts. The first is you were talking about Watergate, and you're talking about the war between some of the media, and if you visit Sage CQ's Washington headquarters, it's in the Watergate, and one of the things, if you're lucky, you get the tour of the room into which the Watergate burglars broke into. And from there, you can look across to where G. Gordon Liddy was there looking in to make sure that they weren't going to get caught when they did.
I think they actually give you that tour whether you want it or not.
You get that tour. But it then turned into this great movie that still remarkably holds up, All the President's Men. And in that is the editorial board meeting of the Washington Post, where people are sitting there fighting over whether or not Watergate gets any inches in the next day's newspaper. Not too long ago, I had a chance actually to visit the Washington Post editorial board. and it's nothing like All the President's Men anymore. The meeting started out about 10 o'clock in the morning, and they were at that point discussing which of the stories had led the web to that point that morning. First point. The next item on the agenda was what they were going to rotate onto the web page at noon to try to continue what it was that was going to happen. Then, in the last quarter of the meeting, they had the discussion about then how many inches people were going to get the next morning in the paper. So there's all of that, and then the Post on top of that has gotten really good at running the same story but with different headings to try to see what it is that they can actually draw people into and what kind of jazzy thing. So they're going social media in the business of real news. And so on the one hand, there's the challenge of trying to find a way in the news business to try to play the social media game, for starters. On the other side, the Gallup organization came up with this poll, and they asked who trusts which forms of organization, and it turns out that a lot of people just don't trust much of anything, and especially don't trust internet news. But it turns out that people at the lowest level of education trust stuff that they read on the internet the most. And that gets into the challenge of more educated people who trust what it is that the New York Times, the Washington Post would try to create and prevent and put on the internet. There are people who are less educated who are more likely to trust the competitors. The polarization that we're seeing, the efforts of Trump to try to play on fake news, I'm not smart enough to be able to figure out what the connections are, but I think there may be something in all of that stuff. And so, I mean, is there something in all of that stuff, do you think, that has to do with polarization, education, differentiation of where people get their news, efforts of the news media to try to play the social media game against others who are out there either playing Candy Crush on the one side or getting the news from the internet otherwise?
I think a lot of people think there are. I mean, the best place to watch right now, if you're interested in those questions, I think is the Huffington Post, which Arianna Huffington founded 12 years ago. I don't know how long it's been. It was specifically set up to be the left's answer to Matt Drudge, who is still going strong. She has finally phased out. They have a new editor-in-chief, Lydia Polgren from the New York Times, who has made a big deal about tabloidizing the Huffington Post so that it will be appealing to these sorts of demographic groups that you're talking about. Will that work, and what effect will that have on its journalism? I don't know yet. Personally, I think it's important for us to sort of trust the intelligence of our audience, and I'm not going to move our journalism or reporting in any one direction because we're trying to play to a specific group. But I think everybody has a different approach to this.
You're also referencing a little bit the chaos out there because there is no business model yet that works. So there's so much experimentation going on, newsletters and sponsorships and events and foundation funding for news organizations, which never would have thought of doing that, how long ago. So it's because everybody is sort of floundering around trying to figure out how to be not just get through the year, but be sustainable. And there isn't a magic answer yet, and you're seeing a lot of that play out.
I think that's right. Steve?
I don't have an answer to your question. That's actually I hadn't thought about it in quite those terms before. We've looked at age distribution by platform, and we definitely see by platform, print, web, social, you'll drop a decade one to the next in terms of our readership. The thing that interests me is there was a study that Pew published a few months ago that looked at this question of trust of content. And the main takeaway was that people who get their news in digital format, if the news is delivered to them from a trusted partner, a family or friend, they'll trust the content. They're more likely to trust the content. So the Pew report flagged that as a problem because it could be completely fake news that's passed along as if it were fact-checked and true. But the flip side is true too, is that if you're pursuing a promotional strategy or distribution strategy on social where your readers are sharing you're encouraging your readers to share with their folks and they are trusted, you win. So it doesn't get to your point, Don, but I think that there may be some other variables in play here that could overcome some of those problems of stratification of trust or access to the content.
I'd like to turn to questions in the audience in just a moment, but one last question to the panel before we do. One of the things, I know lots of journalists, and a couple of years ago I had the chance to be able to chair the search for a new dean of journalism. And here was a public policy guy who was a dean helping the School of Journalism look for a leader in the middle of all this kind of stuff. And one of the things that was out of the mouths of the journalists constantly, this recurring sense that they had a mission, and the mission was to try to capture and distribute the truth. And given the debate over fake news and this big concern that we've got these days over not you can trust anything, I mean, are we in a kind of a post-truth era at this point where the idea of truth just doesn't have any meaning anymore, where it is all relative, or is there something at the core that we really need professional journalists to do that has to do with finding a way to boil out the junk and get to something that constitutes facts and the truth? And the answer, of course, is yes. I'm guessing that you're going to say, but the question is how in the middle of this crazy environment that we find ourselves in?
Well, anybody can commit an act of journalism. If you have one of these and you're able to use any of the apps, you can do journalism. And actually, it's been an amazing explosion in on the scene breaking news from folks like that. So where does a paid professional journalist with an infrastructure around him or her come into play? I think there are at least two things, and I'm sure we can sit here and kind of make a whole list, but one is you need an infrastructure around the working journalist for protection and support. So our guys are physically at risk in their work, and also we get sued, and it's better if we get sued than if an individual freelancer gets sued, and those are facts of life in these days. And so an infrastructure of professional support around working journalists is, if anything, more important today. And two is you develop an obsession, you develop an expertise, you develop your sources. I mean, I think, Nick, you would know this better than I do, but you have to go deep on a story. You have to have this rich knowledge to explain the context within which the disparate events of the day take place. That's information, but journalism is when you can knit it together into a story that's coherent and where you can confidently show your work and let it be tested by people. And then I think you're justifying the existence of this kind of practice.
Which really is getting to more than just this post, how many hits. It's the thing that comes after that and then comes after that. Linda?
I think there's a generally agreed upon sort of set of principles, really, in terms of verification and ethics that most mainstream organizations adhere to. Because essentially, you're in the business of trust. You're selling trust. You've got nothing else to sell there. And so you need to be, transparent in terms of your funding, which is becoming a bigger issue now because so many people so many organizations have multiple funding sources. So you have to make very clear where the money's coming from. But then you adhere to your principles, and you don't have anything else. So, and I think that, again, getting back to the Times and the Post, and yes, people read other things, but people are willing to pay for that. So there's some understanding out there that it's a value. You're selling your stuff. So everybody isn't willing to pay. Everybody doesn't understand, kind of what good journalism is. But there are enough people who do, and we need to spread the word better, I think.
Maybe. Right. Well, I think principles are important. I think infrastructure is critical. People don't realize how expensive infrastructure is, and that's why there are half as many journalists today as there were 10 years ago. The question is going to be how many people are willing to pay for these things, and how many things will you pay for? Can we have one national newspaper that does everything you want it to do? 2 is not enough. We were talking today about how everything left of the Beltway, everything west of D.C. Could certainly use a lot more coverage, but who's going to pay for that? I subscribe to 40 magazines, in part because I can write them off, and in part because this is the thing I'm most interested in. How many things will the average consumer support? We don't know the answer to that yet.
And will they read news about what happens in Annapolis or in Sacramento or in Austin or in Springfield? And it's the decline, especially of coverage at the state level, that may put the sharpest focus on what you've just said.
At some point, because we're all in the attention game, technology also pushed us to the decision that news must also be entertainment. And I don't know how we move back from that, but like the reason nobody wants to read what's going on in Sacramento is because it's really not as exciting as a million other things I can be doing right now. Is there some sort of like media literacy or something else that needs to be done where we can just bring news back to the function that it used to serve?
Well, you opened the door on that one. So I think the restoration of civics education in the schools and a modern curriculum is like absolute baseline, including a media literacy component, would be a brilliant move. Any state that is first mover on that wins, because they'll develop a constituency that'll enrich the cultural life of that state in ways that states that don't won't. So it's an investment in a future culture, a cultural capital of a community, I think.
I'll tell you at least one thing by way of reassurance, and then I want to ask for questions from the audience. But I did a session on fake news to a group of 125 students last Wednesday. And when I was just a pup, there was just no way that anybody would put their hand up in a class of 125. And they were all over it. Hands just shooting up. In terms of what you're saying, there's certainly the audience there, and students desperately want to get in on this game. So there's something to be done here on this, because they are concerned about the same stuff that we've been talking about. And I showed them the graph about the spread between Republicans versus Democrats trusting the news, and they were sitting back there and they were worried. And they were and someone were saying, are there data points in between? They're freshmen pulling this graph apart. They're worried folks. And so there's an audience for what you're talking about somehow. If we can find a way to put the pieces together, because there's a sense there that things are maybe not quite right. Now, questions here. Who wants in first? Yes, sir.
Most of the discussion has been about what the journalist does. There's been some discussion, of course, on the economics of the journalism industry. But I haven't heard anything about what is important to us as political scientists, namely that the function of journalism in the wider democratic context is to explain to people what the meaning of various governmental actions would be. During an election campaign, for example, proposals are made, but the proposals don't get any depth of coverage from the media, so that we know that some of the proposals are fake proposals, essentially, and others are not very well developed. Now, there was a time, I forget how many years ago, when journalists were criticizing each other for the horse race coverage of an election. Well, that has not changed. We're still stuck on the horse race. But when is it that we learn that proposals of candidates running for office who might be the leader of the world are proposing things that are either infeasible or dangerous? And why is it that these are not being covered by any news sources at all, and thus not informing the public and leaving the electorate relatively reliant on ideology and not fact?
It's an interesting question, because political science, as you know, hasn't always been kind to journalism. And one of the concerns that's popped up from time to time is this concern about too much attention on horse race coverage, not enough on issues, that the public is worse as a result of that, and we end up with uninformed voters who end up going to the polls or not going to the polls at all.
The horse race is fun. I mean, it's right there in the name. The horse race is the entertainment of news. And I think when a lot of news organizations try to cover the policy proposals, because they will try to cover everything, you don't read them. I mean, that's that's a problem, right? You can go to like a BBC model of funding, you can go to nonprofit models of funding, but as long as most of the media is advertising driven and audience focused, they will not continue to do what you have shown with your time you do not want to read.
Steve?
I was just going to say that, was it Jeff Zucker who said it was good, trouble on the political campaign was good for CBS. It was a business decision to pursue that line of reporting. CNN treats it as a sports analogy. So cable TV especially plays to the problem that you've defined. I guess I would disagree with one thing you said, which is that in fact there was tremendous coverage during this election cycle by some media outlets of policy debates amongst both parties, but it had no traction whatsoever. It wasn't picked up by the cable nets, it wasn't reinforced, and so it evaporated on the latest and next outrage that one of the candidates delivered. And I think the best example actually of proper coverage of policy debates was the debate inside the Democratic Party over the party platform, because there were two contending visions of what that party should be in the future, and it was reported.
Yep. Follow-up?
Yes. Lacking this kind of coverage of issues during the campaign is one thing, but on 2 days after the election, the LA Times, which I read regularly, started covering all the issues and their feasibility. In other words, after the election, suddenly this becomes relevant. So I wrote the people that supposedly are in charge of this, and I said, why are you doing it the opposite way?
Can I just
Sure.
say one thing to that? So, point perfectly well taken. On Halloween Day, we published a story about the so-called Golden Shower dossier that the FBI had possession, and I was reviewing the veracity of that story, and it had been delivered by a former British counterintelligence agent. That story dropped the same day that Jim Comey's second email about Hillary's emails dropped, and the Times, the Post, the LA Times, CNN, Fox, MSNBC covered the last story and not the first story. And it wasn't until January that CNN and BuzzFeed actually published the dossier itself. So there's a perfect case in point where under normal political circumstances, the publication of the FBI in receipt of that kind of intelligence information should have been the story of the day. It wasn't.
There's also a million variables here. Sorry to jump in really quick. That one specifically is interesting to me because I was in New York with Clara Jeffrey, the editor of Mother Jones, in January when everybody else started picking it up, and she couldn't have been more frustrated that Mother Jones was there months ago and nobody was talking about it. We're talking about a site that reaches 14 million people a month. It's a huge audience, and sometimes you can't move the needle no matter what you do, and that's some weird internet voodoo that good luck to anybody who tries to figure it out.
Well, I think we got bigfooted by the Comey story. I think that's what it came down to.
Linda?
I do think that there was the coverage that you're complaining was lacking, but it got buried. I mean, it got really buried on the best news sites. And the other thing that happened, quite frankly, is that there was a fair amount of sheepishness on the part of the media because they hadn't taken Donald Trump seriously until really very, very late in the campaign. And I think, that's been pretty widely acknowledged as a failing by most of the media themselves that hopefully won't be repeated.
That's one promise that I think is probably like to be true. Other questions? Yes, sir. Back here if we can.
Sorry. So I was curious about what you said actually about the history of this issue and the fact that this is nothing new, but it's the first time in my life where I've heard the term and where there seems to be a collective consciousness and a discussion of it. And so I'm wondering, in previous times, was there a collective consciousness of the issue amongst the population, or at least a portion of it? And if so, how did that impact the issue? Or is this something, or is the fact that we're talking about it something very new?
Mm-hmm. I just
Forget the panel. Don, you're probably the best one to answer this, aren't you?
I'm not sure. One of the things, again, I did fake news for the students last week, and I put up, just for fun, the Cleopatra story, which, by the way, Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, I had no idea who they were. And so note to self, most millennials don't watch movies before 1990. But the second thing is, though, that I put Triumph of the Will and the Frank Capra series up there. And they sort of understood that the idea of trying to present images designed to convince is nothing new. They immediately latched onto that. And again, the hands are sort of flying in the air. And they sort of understood that there is at least a link over time in the effort to try to, in the media, present ideas designed to try to convince people of certain points of view. And sometimes people call it propaganda. There's a lot of propaganda during, and through the course of history. There's a Broadway musical that has that as an underlying piece of that, for which people are paying $2,000 a seat. That some of the battle between Hamilton and Burr had to do with a bit of fake news and propaganda going back and forth and all this stuff. So some of this is not new. So the question is, why are we fussed up about this?
I think you're answering it already, right? Which is that it has happened before. You are aware of it. We just called it propaganda, or we called it something else. For some reason, fake news has become this large umbrella because it's in your Twitter feed 8 times a day from the president, if not everybody else. I think the first step is to just start calling things what they are instead of everything being fake news. Like, let's call a conspiracy theory a conspiracy theory, propaganda, a lie, which most publishers are afraid to use for various legal reasons. And let's call whatever sad satire Andy Borowitz is doing at The New Yorker something else entirely. But we have to start breaking that down a little bit more.
But one question in all of this, just to sort of step back, is it a possibility that part of this fake news stuff is in fact a reaction to your question, that stepping away from horse races and getting into issues is in fact what fake news is all about? That fake news is about issues, not horse races. That is about differences of opinion and the ways in which people filter their discussions about that. Maybe leaving aside the question of the fact that fake news makes the discussion seem pejorative, is there maybe a ray of sunshine underneath all of this, that in fact it's shining a light in policy debates?
No.
No? Okay. Fair enough.
I just, the two things that came to mind as you were talking, Don, were Hillary's emails and Barack Obama's birth certificate. Neither policy related.
Right.
Totally dominate the news cycle. I mean, to your point, there's so much wasted ink and pixels on those frickin' emails. It's just a lie. It's just a lie. So, but it made, it was pushed hard by interested parties, pushed really hard into the media system. They had a megaphone through Fox, Breitbart, and Drudge to keep that story moving. And they had a candidate who had all the reason in the world to keep that story alive. So we as a democracy are not prepared to fight that kind of a truth fight, given the media that exists as it does today. And I think that's actually the problem.
And so the follow-up question to that is, to the degree to which what's new is the weaponization of this in a targeted kind of way. How much of that gets back to a question we talked about earlier, which is how much the source of funding and the ability to be able to fund the weaponization of the information is both what's new, what's dangerous, and what it is that the media are struggling trying to figure out how to deal with.
The weaponization is free. I mean, you don't have to pay to be on social media. But, well, you go ahead.
I mean, there is an untold story of following the money behind the media, right? So whether it's the Mercers or whomever would be the equivalent on the left that's paying for this kind of stuff, and see where it goes. This latest thing with the New America Foundation's weak response to Google's direct or indirect pressure. It's not clear what actually happened, but money is unregulated, profoundly so. It's unequally concentrated, and so it has overweening influence in all facets of our life right now. Media is one of them.
No matter how you're funded, though, and this goes for nonprofits like my own and for the media, you are at some point going to get pushback from the people funding you because they want to see results that are different than the ones that you're showing. And that goes way back. Michael and I were talking about this earlier, to the car dealership that threatened to pull the ads when you wrote a bad story about his business practices, which I happen to meet, in 2 little newspapers I worked for. And it's the same as when the New York Times has to go up against the government. And it's the same when New America has to go up against Google. At some point, you have to push back. And because there's no way to immunize yourself. If you're taking money from people, and we all do, and whether it was advertisers in the old days or foundations now or corporations, they want to see certain results. You have to be transparent about who is giving you the money, and then you have to be very clear with the people giving you the money what your standards are, and that you are in control of your own content. And you can expect to get into some little dust-ups from time to time over that. But, you have to draw your lines.
And there's a paradox underlying all this stuff, which is perhaps that free media costs a lot of money to be able to put together. And there really is a sort of packaging issue. I saw a hand up over here. Yes, sir.
So there was a moment during the discussion, I think it was you, Steve, when you said that we're at a point of partisan tribalism. So I think a lot of that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of, where the source of that is people do have a mistrust of mainstream media. And so they're much more willing to, find alternative facts, different sources, things like that online. And a lot of it is mistrust in the funding for a lot of the sources. Like Donald Trump, usually when he mentions the New York Times, he calls them the failing New York Times. And kind of the implication there is that they're just trying to find whatever stories they can in order to sensationalize it, in order to keep themselves afloat, that kind of a thing. So I guess my question is, how well-founded are those criticisms or, just kind of, how well-founded are those suspicions in the mainstream media, and where that funding is coming from? How much of an effect is that funding having on things like journalistic ethics? And is it possible for journalists to, go around that and not have funding affect them in a way that is going to, ultimately create what our news is?
Yeah, that's a great question. 2 parts towards an answer. So I remember when, 3 network TV channels, 2 or 3 papers of record, the voice of God coming at you all the time, and a Cold War consensus that established a certain boundary of legitimate discourse, and everything outside of that was considered subversive or irrelevant. And so to the history of my organization, when Mother Jones was founded in '76, the tagline was a magazine for the rest of us. Well, that no longer applies because the control that those dominant networks and print outlets had on this interpretation of the events of the day, and frankly the interpenetration of the intelligence systems and the media systems that existed at that time, that to reinforce that's over, and it's not coming back. And that fragmentation or distributed knowledge has this incredible liberatory moment. Never forget that. The fact that you can get a different interpretation of the world out to people is an incredibly powerful and democratizing moment, I think. And it's dangerous too, because there are no standards, there's no cultural norms, there's no professional practice. In this country, we don't have a Standards and Ethics Bureau. There's no Official Secrets Act. There's nothing that says, hey, you can't really do that. Right? So it's wide open right now, which is where the back door of uncontrolled money comes in to not enable speech, but to increase the volume of the speech. That's the danger of the money, is that how loud it gets to be. for us, and this is sort of my second part to your answer, it doesn't quite get to what you're asking, but, we talked about earlier about a diversity of revenue streams is absolutely essential, not only to protect the organization through the ups and downs of the economy, but to protect us from being unusually vulnerable to pressure from individual donors or funders. So we've made a point of having a diverse source of revenue and relying on a lot of small donor gifts, small individual gifts and subscriptions, as well as all the usual stuff that happens. So 70% of our revenue comes from readers, and only 15% from foundations and 15% from advertising. So it gives us, in this particular instance, a relatively strong basis to push back against undue influence from potential funding sources, to the point where if we need to fire somebody, as painful as it'll be, we'll fire a funder. We won't go back to him, or we won't take the money. So it's a complicated dance. I don't deny that. It's filled with nuance. But I think that's some version of that is what journalism needs.
I think the key to funding also is that, at least the way we do it, and my understanding is the way news organizations do it as well, the idea originates with the organization. With us, it originates with our researchers. In media organizations that take funding, it originates in the newsroom. And then you go out to seek the funding. You don't have the funders come to you and try to commission something. And that's a really important distinction.
I'll just add
Nick?
that I don't agree with the premise. I don't think that concern over funding sources influencing journalism is the primary reason that people distrust media. First of all, there's not that much money in media to begin with. And I think that maybe because we're oftentimes the only ones reading our stuff, journalists are especially good at writing about journalism. The reason that we all know about the New America Google situation that Steve mentioned is because the New York Times is on top of it. And will be until this thing goes away, maybe more so than anything we saw in the 2016 election. And just from my own personal experience, I don't know anybody who's lasted at a reputable media outfit who hasn't gone to war for the ethics of that institution. Linda described them as small dust-ups, but I've been to all-out battle.
Well, I've been there
over and over again. And the people who don't want to fight for the ethics of journalism just go into PR and make a lot more money anyway. So they're a scrappy bunch.
Great stuff. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time, but I want to give each of you just a short moment. You've got a group of political scientists here, and some political scientists have been shooting questions at you. What would you tell political scientists that either they need to pay attention to, that they need to know, the questions they need most to worry about? What is it that you would want political scientists in this room to take away from this session? If I give each just a moment to challenge us before we leave. Who wants in there first?
That's a big ask. I don't have that. I just lost that. That was my last great line. I'm all burnt out. I would just say to any consumers of media, political scientists or otherwise, challenge your own media diet, expand it where you can. And I'm not saying add somebody who self-describes as right-wing because you think you read what is otherwise considered a liberal news source. Just get your information from multiple sources, and when you find the places you trust, support them and subscribe to them. They need you.
Yep. Sounds good. Nick, thanks.
I would repeat, support the sources that you trust. The important thing is it takes money to do journalism, and expecting it all to come free to you is really the way to hell here. So I think that, and also holding them accountable. I mean, I'm glad to hear that you wrote to the LA Times, and you made your voice known. Okay, keep doing that.
Everybody you wrote to is gone though. They all just got axed.
Well, that's why you have to keep writing. There'll be new people. But holding news organizations accountable is really important.
Yeah, so maybe this is more for the American Sociological Association than the APSA, but whatever. I would love somebody to spend some time with a bunch of different media, journalism outfits, looking at the modern, as it really exists, work process. Like, how does the stuff actually get made today? Because people have this cockamamie notion, like from that HBO show or whatever, or bad movies, or or good movies about how the news gets made, and it's not the same. It's the workflow is totally different, and it'd be really fun to have somebody who has a little bit of distance on it, kind of come in and watch and interpret and see how that reality gets constructed. That'd be cool.
Because my sense of the people who are doing that on the inside are both concerned about that, but it is an incredible show to watch. And so it'd be great fun to be able to do it. And I will say one last thing that I'm struck by, the theme toward the end here that all of you expressed was the importance of trust and building trust in the news that you hear. And we began by talking about fake news. And somehow there's this connection between that news which is fake and that news which we trust, and trying to find a way to make that kind of connection. And that connection that you've made for the last hour is just a great contribution to all of us. So thank you very much. Please, all of you join me and thanking our panelists for this evening. Thanks so much to all of you for coming too. Thanks.